Thank you so much, Hunter, for that lovely introduction. And it was a great privilege to spend all day talking to Hunter. She is a true leader not only in Arkansas, but nationally. And it was just a lovely day, and I got to see a lot of the scenery. Thank you for inviting me here to the Clinton School of Public Service. I really am grateful for this opportunity, and hope that I can raise some questions with you tonight and maybe answer some as well. So I'll welcome your questions when I'm finished. So my topic, the economic recession and nonprofits, challenges and opportunities, is a difficult one. The challenges are visible all around us for those of us in this nonprofit sector. The opportunities are a little harder to see. Sometimes we have to squint a little and hope for the best. But I think they're there. I'm an optimist, and I think that some better times are coming. Today I'm going to sketch out a brief overview of the nonprofit sector based on some research by our National Center for Charitable Statistics, and a little bit about the recession and its impact on nonprofits. I'm going to give you a preliminary peek at some new data. We've just done a national survey of nonprofit organizations, and to see what kind of an impact the recession is having on nonprofits, and also a little bit about how their relationship with government is evolving, what are the sticking points, and what do we have to be aware of in the future, what's working, what's not working. So, challenges. First, it's important to understand a little bit about the nonprofit sector. How many of you work in the nonprofit sector? Oh, I don't have to say too much then. Okay. First thing I talk about when I talk about the nonprofit sector is that it's diverse. It's large organizations like universities and hospitals, small organizations like homeless shelters, and parent-teacher associations. There are varied missions and activities, research, teaching, preventing disease, promoting safe driving, and many, many other things. There are different board and management styles. Some are top-down, some are hierarchical, some are staffed mainly by volunteers, others have a huge phalanx of research or medical staff or university professors. They have mixed revenues, and I think this is the one that comes as a surprise to folks who don't know the sector too well. Fee-for-service is a very important, probably the largest component of revenues in the nonprofit sector. Then we also have contributions, government grants and contracts, and then every variety of individual, foundation, corporate contributions. So keep in mind this complex revenue stream when we talk about the recession and its impact on nonprofits. The roles that nonprofits play in the economy sometimes and in the society, sometimes not very well appreciated. Since I'm a political scientist, I like to point out the civic role. Promoting civic participation, bringing community together, engaging folks in their communities to make them better. Then also there are religious organizations, values-based organizations, arts, culture, humanities. And one thing that folks often forget is that nonprofit organizations are employers, and they're significant employers. And they're very involved in helping to shape public policy, prevent things that they don't want to see happen, and also to encourage the kinds of policies that they think make sense based on their experience in their communities and in their states. What do I see as the trends? Nonprofit sector is large and getting larger. It's growing faster than business and government. There are a lot of imperatives and things that society and government and funders want nonprofits to do: become more transparent, be more accountable, certainly to be more effective and efficient, collaborate, merge with other organizations, be innovative. We hear a lot of this from the current President Obama and this Office of Social Innovation. Be innovative and entrepreneurial. These are not hard for nonprofits. They've been doing it for a very long time. But I think one of the demands is challenging for many nonprofits, and that is to document their impacts and their outcomes. And I would add to that, and communicate them so people know what you're doing and how you're serving. Now, it's widely understood that we're all facing hard times, but let's take a brief break here and look at how many nonprofits there are. About 1.9 million nonprofits. This is all kinds, 501c3, charities, foundations, credit unions, all of the different kinds of business associations. It's a huge part of the economy in the U.S. There are 1.5 million of these organizations that are registered with the IRS. Congregations we count as nonprofits, but they don't have to register with the IRS. They're automatically nonprofit charitable organizations. And there are about 386,000 of them. 1.1 million are charitable nonprofits, and by that I mean 501c3, if you know your tax code. These are the ones that you can make a donation to and you can take it off on your income tax. We're going to focus mostly on those today, but I wanted you to have the bigger picture first. Nonprofits contribute about 5% of GDP, bigger than the auto industry, bigger than lots of industries in this country. They employ 13.5 million people. You're not going to remember all this, but I just want you to get a sense that we're talking about a lot of people who work in this sector. 9.4% of wages and 543 billion in salaries. These kinds of facts make people sit up and say, this must be an important sector of the economy. And having that data at our fingertips allows us to talk knowledgeably about what nonprofits are doing. And before we had this information, this was truly the invisible sector. I would say the glass is about half full now. We're a little more visible than we were 10 years ago, a lot more visible than we were when I first came into this sector. We didn't even have the language of nonprofit sector. And we chiefly thought in terms of contributions that each of us made. Now, this is a snapshot of charities, and what's important to see here is, again, the diversity of organizations. If you look at the purpley part of the pie, human services are the largest part of the charitable sector. About a third of the organizations are human services. By that I mean all kinds of services, homeless, feeding, mentoring, youth development, all the different kinds of things that go on at the community level. International and foreign affairs, a very tiny sliver, less than 2%. Health is about 12%. That's where our hospitals and clinics and things like that. And education is about 18%. A lot of higher education is in the nonprofit sector, as are many private schools, but not public education. We're not counting a public education here. This is nonprofits. So that's kind of an overview. And tonight when I talk about the data that we're collecting, it really concerns the human services sector. That's where we're going to talk about. Now, the important thing to get from this slide is that a very small proportion of organizations, look at the bottom line, about 4% of charities have 85% of the resources. What does that tell us? Hospitals and universities, a small proportion of the sector, but that's where most of the employment and most of the resources are. Most of the nonprofits in the sector are small. 45% have fewer than $100,000 in revenue. So we have a very diverse sector in terms of the size. Most of the organizations probably in your communities are between 100,000 and 1 million, those that are providing human services, but there's lots of variation. I wanted to just give you a quick snapshot of Arkansas. You'll see that your human services sector is about 38%, a little larger than the nation as a whole, and education is about 16%. So, and health is about the same at 12%. The human services, the charities in Arkansas are about 2,700 organizations. The national survey that I'm going to talk a little bit about is a large survey, about 2,500 organizations, and it's weighted and nationally representative, but it also has enough weight for us to be able to talk about the various states. You're getting a preview tonight. We haven't released any of the data yet. You're the first, or actually the second. We talked a little bit about it this afternoon. But what we can do, what we'll be able to do is compare state by state to look at profiles of their nonprofit sectors, given the survey data that we have. Let's have just a few minutes about the recession. We're calling it the Great Recession. It's probably the deepest one we've had since the Great Depression. Unemployment right now is about 9.7%. Compare that to about 3.7 or 9 a year in the year 2000. We're in dire straits in terms of employment. 39.1 million Americans under the poverty line. Median household income has slipped from $52.6 to $52,000. And individuals, businesses, governments are all feeling this recession. I call it a triple whammy because nonprofits donations are down. We'll look at that data in a minute. Government funding is down, and the needs and demands, especially for human services, are way up. If we look at the latest data on giving, the Giving USA Foundation just released its data this week, and we see that individual giving is down 0.4%. Now that's a lot less than we thought it was going to be. People are reaching into their pockets and making an extra effort. Bequests, those are, after death gifts, are down. I think there's a little statistical anomaly there, but down about 23.9%. You can't always predict when somebody's going to die, so those data are up and down, good years and bad years, depending on your definition. Foundation grants, however, are about 8.9% down from the previous year. And that's to be expected because foundations took a huge hit in their endowments last year. And they do their grants on rolling averages of the previous year or previous several years. The surprise in this is that corporate giving is up 5.5%, but it's not so much money, it's more that corporations are digging into their inventories and giving in-kind gifts. So they're not registering as having a decline. Now let's look at the impact of the recession on states and federal budgets. They're all in the red. No surprise there, almost all in the red. States face a revenue gap of about $194 billion for 2010, and 38 states are looking forward to another session of red ink in 2011. The federal government has about an $802 billion deficit for the first 7 months of 2010. Remember, their fiscal year ends in September 30th. All levels of government are cutting back. And guess where they're cutting back? On a lot of the services that many nonprofits provide. In our survey, we asked nonprofits, what were they doing to no, this one, I'm sorry, I went out of order here. How did the nonprofits that answered our survey fare in terms of reduced revenues? Well, no surprise here. Most of them experienced a cut in investment income, those that had investments, about 70%. Corporate donations were down about 57%. So this is contrary to the finding of the Giving USA, which is based on estimates. So these are real responses from real organizations. The foundation funding is down, federated giving is down. Look down to about the 4 from the bottom. Individual giving is down about almost 50%. So nonprofits are finding all of their revenue sources down. There's not one that's on the positive side. Although fees from, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it exactly that way. 34% of nonprofits had decrease in fees, but 70% of nonprofits did not see a decrease in their fee income. Remember, those would be tuition, those would be hospitals, those would be voucher payments of individuals who come in for a service that's already paid for. Now, the fourth whammy. Some state and local governments are seeking to bolster their budgets by looking to nonprofits. They are rescinding tax-exempt status for certain kinds of organizations if they judge them not to be true nonprofits. They're levying special fees, user fees, and special taxes. About 15% of the organizations in our survey were finding that the extra taxes and service fees were being levied on them. And they're seeking states are seeking payments, and municipalities, payments in lieu of taxes. In other words, if you're a nonprofit that has sitting on a parcel of land that doesn't pay property tax, you might find the government coming around and saying, we really need to get some revenue from you. Boston is doing this, Philadelphia is doing this, Pittsburgh is doing this. So there are some trends in that direction. Now, the other piece of the pie is that government funders are requiring nonprofits to help foot the bill for contracted services. They're looking at delaying payments because they can't afford to pay. They're looking at requiring matching funds for grants or contracts. They're also not paying the full price for contracted services that nonprofits are providing for governments to serve their constituencies. So these are some of the things that are on the negative side. We asked nonprofits what kinds of problems they were experiencing. And this slide shows us whether it's not a problem in purple, whether it's a small problem in, I guess that's a burgundy, and a large problem in the bright blue. Payments do not cover the full cost of services that we provide under state and federal and local government and contracts. 44% said that was a large problem. And you add to that the ones that said it's a small problem, and you get about, 68% for whom it is a problem. So that's one of the biggest issues for nonprofits. We were hearing it anecdotally around the country. Now we have the data that shows that it is a problem that nonprofits are really struggling with. The second problem is the complexity of applying for and also reporting on grants and contracts. You can see that 37% feel that applying for those or reporting for those grants and contracts is a huge problem for them. There's a lot of paperwork. Many nonprofits don't have the capacity or the staff to really do a good job of it, and they're finding that is a deterrent for them. At the bottom, we have some folks who feel that government changing the terms of their contract is also a problem. And at the bottom, late payments for funds, which I mentioned before, is a problem for almost half of organizations. For some, it's a big problem. For others, it's, a less big problem, but still there. So these are some of the issues that are affecting nonprofits in their relationship with government, and we're talking state, local, and federal at this point. And this is all. These are also issues that nonprofits can, get together and start doing something about. There are efforts in Washington, and I know at the state levels, to begin talking about some of these issues. There's a federal grants partnership at the national level where folks are coming together and saying, hey, can't we do a better job? Can't we make this grants and contracting process smoother, a little easier? What if we use the same terminology, required the same kinds of reports, required finances to be reported in the same categories? It would save people a lot of money and a lot of angst if we could get together and do those kinds of things. That won't happen unless nonprofits raise their voices. This is not Arkansas Human Services, and for Arkansas, the biggest problems were the most difficulty for them was the complexity and time required for reporting their grants and contracts, about 20%. And 32% is a smaller problem, but still a problem. And they go down to the bottom, and late payments aren't as much of a problem for Arkansas. Do you have a key? So if we look at the impact of the recession on human services nonprofits, what did they do in the face of the recession? Well, first of all, many of the organizations froze or reduced their employee salaries. Guess what's expendable in nonprofit organizations? The employee salaries. And 48% nationally, but only 23.7% in Arkansas. 38% drew down on their reserves, 34% in Arkansas. 36% reduced the number of employees, 15% in Arkansas. We see some different patterns coming here. And as I look at the data, other states have different patterns as well. But you can start to see that the national pattern's one thing, but what happens in your own state or your locality is going to be a little bit different. 21% nationally reduced staff benefits, 24% in Arkansas. 20% borrowed funds to help them get through the shortfall in cash, so they could keep producing their services. In Arkansas, it was about 10.5%. 20% reduced the numbers of programs and services. In Arkansas, that was 29%. This gives you a little clue about how nonprofits are dealing with the recession and also how it varies. But one of the things that seems constant is that the first thing to go is to really cut down on the employee salaries. Drawing down reserves, the second thing that organizations did, but not every organization had reserves to draw down. So that's quite interesting. Unfortunately, cutting staff exacerbates the unemployment situation. Cutting programs such as daycare and for seniors and children also has an impact on who's able to work. And so the ripple effect of some of these cuts really is much broader than just, you know, 1 or 2 or 25 or a couple thousand organizations cut staff. The ripples, unfortunately, go much broader. When we looked and asked about deficits, 42.6% nationally at the end of 2009 had a deficit, 33% in Arkansas. Revenues and surpluses equal, ended the year with equal amounts, about a third, and had a surplus, 24% nationally and 33% in Arkansas. You're doing better than the national average there. These findings are corroborated by the Nonprofit Finance Fund that did a survey among 1,300 nonprofits. And the bad news is that of those who had some money left at the end of the year, the majority, 61%, had less than 3 months of cash available. So don't think that's a piggy bank sitting there. It's actually a very narrow safety cushion. So what are the challenges for the nonprofit sector? Obviously, leadership. It's always an issue, but particularly in these bad times, leadership to get organizations through. And by that I mean internal leadership. Where do you cut? Where do you maintain the integrity of the organization? How do you maintain your mission when your revenues and your resources are constrained, and yet you have a mission to serve your community and the clients? Revenue generation is always an issue for nonprofit organizations. Where are new sources of revenue? One of the studies that we were doing at the Urban Institute with some of the software vendors of fundraising software shows that nonprofits are probably not paying enough attention to donors they already have in the fold. In other words, keeping the links open to those keeping those donors aware of what you're doing, communicating with them. A lot of money goes into cultivating new donors every year, but it's those already committed ones, those ones that you should be looking out for. Performance measurement, I mentioned that early on. That's a demand for the nonprofit sector. We've got to do a good job of telling the public and our funders what we're achieving with the resources that we have. And a performance measurement is required in a lot of government grants and contracts. And we've got to do a better job of not just saying, you know, we have X numbers of children in our daycare, but what is the quality of that daycare? How are those children faring? What a mentoring program? We're learning some things about what makes an effective organization. That demand's not going to go away. I'm in a lot of meetings these days with folks who are working on performance measures. Very many of them are kind of donor down, what the donor wants to be able to say. We're working on a system that's bottom up. And it's really important for nonprofits to have a say in what's important for you to measure, what do you want to be held accountable for, and how are you going to get that information and data. The demand is there, and in these hard times, those organizations that can do that and do that well are the ones that are going to fare better. And at the bottom of the list, but it would probably be at the top of my list, I'm a political scientist after all, is advocacy. Nonprofits have to find their voices. They have to have a seat at the policy table. They have to make known the needs of the people they serve and the communities that they're active in. They have to be on the radar screen. Or guess what? Whenever the budget's cut, what's going to be cut first? If you're not talking about the needs of your communities, you who know them, who is going to? And I think it's not as simple as that, but in a way it is a simple message. If you don't have a voice and you don't do things that will help people to understand the sector and join wonderful organizations like ACE and help them to raise the voice for you and with you, then what's going to happen to our communities? So if I were to sum up, I'd say that the nonprofit sector's never been larger. It's never been more important. Government does a lot of the work of caring for communities through nonprofit organizations. This comes as a surprise to some folks who say, we have a welfare state, government's doing it. We don't have a welfare state in the European sense of the word. Much of what happens to take care of children and families and our communities comes through nonprofit organization, often with government revenues, to be sure, but what is happening to our social safety net is really a province of nonprofit organizations. Demands on the sector are urgent and growing in this economic climate. The resources are often inadequate. You can tell me more about that than I can tell you. Nonprofit efficiency and effectiveness, the bywords of our era, are true. We need to have efficiency, we need to have effectiveness, but that's not sufficient. Leadership is crucial. Your board, staff, community members, governors, college and university presidents, they all have to be out there understanding what's going on and standing up for what our communities need. And bottom line, nonprofits have to have a voice at the policy table. With that, let me end and entertain your questions.
If you do have a question, please raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Any questions? Right here. Hold on. Come behind you.
Thank you. My name is Becca Green, and my question pertains to the complexity and time that has been reported by nonprofits that it takes to fill out a grant and apply for that. I myself have seen many of the state and federal grants that are out there require a lot of research and statistics that government agencies already have. So I guess my question is there any kind of initiative for a central agency that would work on behalf of nonprofits to encourage these grants to pull their information for general statistics from the government agencies that already have them and not put the onus on nonprofits?
I'm so glad you asked that question. There is an initiative. Representative Betty McCollum of St. Paul is working on a bill. It's called the Nonprofit Sector and Community Solutions Act, which will set up a council to assess the relationship of the federal government to nonprofit organizations. And one of the really important aspects of it is what data does the government have already, and where, how can it be organized in such a way that we can pull out the information that pertains to nonprofit organizations. The council will be tasked with doing studies, research, and going across the agencies of the federal government to try to see if we can't bring this together. Efficiency, effectiveness, data, research, yes. So when you hear about this bill, your voice, we need your voice to help make it happen.
One second.
In terms of the relative size and expenses incurred by a nonprofit, at what point, what level of expenses would you say that a professional director, an executive director, would be justified? At what level of expenses, size, et cetera? Where do you draw the line between when you have a predominantly amateur volunteer group that has a certain amount of expenses, what amount of expenses start to justify having a professional director come in an executive capacity?
Right. I don't think there's one answer to that. It really depends. It sounds like a cop-out, but let me give you an example. If you have a scholarship fund and it's run by volunteers, you may never need an executive director. However, if it gets to be at a certain level, of money going out the door, then you might need somebody who is accounting for it, or somebody who's doing outreach in the community. Some organizations as small as $100,000 have an executive director because of the nature of their work. If you had a daycare center, it might not have much in the way of revenue, but certainly it would need staff and volunteers probably. So it depends on the level of volunteers for the very small organization and the nature of the work. Some kinds of work just really require a professional to be in charge. Other kinds of work, I mean, if you're doing counseling, for example, you might have a $50,000 organization that's doing counseling, and it might have volunteer outreach, but it needs a professional to do some. Some can be done by consultants, some can be done by volunteers. So there's not any one answer to that, but I have seen organizations as small as even 75,000 that has one staff person. So it really depends on what they're doing.
For years, people were asked, who is the most trusted person you know? And I don't remember the poll results exactly, but for a long time, pharmacists, I remember, were among the most trusted people. What is your perception of people who are in the nonprofit sector in terms of that aura of public trust? Is there more integrity and accountability in this group compared to the other sectors of our world? Or is that not being very objective?
I don't think we have objective information on that. For many years, the polls show that certain kinds of nonprofits were viewed to be more trustworthy. I'm not sure what the data would say today. As the nonprofit sector has gotten more visible and larger and more money has been involved, there are some pretty visible scandals out there that, when the United Way scandal hit 20 years ago, that really undermined a lot of confidence in the United Way system. And in some of the large churches that have had, moral problems, that has also undermined some credibility. When the Red Cross was questioned after 9/11. So I think that for many folks, they still view the sector with a lot of trust. But I think we have to remind people that where there are individual human beings involved, there's going to be malfeasance. But it's up to the board, it's up to the staff to try to squelch that and take care of it in as honest and forthrightly as possible. So I think there is a reservoir of trust, otherwise people wouldn't still be giving money to nonprofits. And we still have, a huge reservoir of folks who are not only giving, but volunteering. They're on boards. So we have a lot of social capital in the nonprofit sector still. And I think that's the measure that we probably would have to use.
Do you have a feel for the appropriate percent of operating budget that a good nonprofit might want to spend on data collection and analysis, and both in support of fundraising efforts and accountability?
All of it, no. No, but I think, different organizations use different, sort of metrics. I know that there are some foundations who set aside 10% for evaluation, for example. My organization, which is a research institute, that's what we do. Our whole budget is for research. So I don't think anybody has a metric for that, but the important thing is that organizations collect enough information so that they know what they're doing. And the way I come at the data and information from an individual organization's perspective is, you ought to be collecting information that helps you to know what you're achieving, to feed back into your performance loop, right? If you don't know what you're achieving, how can you tell whether you're making progress toward your goals? I'm working with a software company right now, and we're building an online outcomes and effective practices portal. So this will be a one-stop shop for organizations to go to download information about indicators and logic models and effective practices, the ones that we can find, and tools to measure it. And this software person gets up and says, I've actually seen organizations that have done harm because they didn't know the outcome of the programs. And the example given is, there was an organization in Washington that was a domestic violence shelter, and it decided to bring together the husbands to get them in a focus group and talking to one another to help to dampen down their abusive behavior. When it was finally evaluated, what they found was that what was happening was that bad behavior was being reinforced. It took an evaluation to show that that was not an effective practice. So, you know, we wouldn't condemn the organization. It collected the data. It said, this is not what we had hoped to do, and changed its behavior. But unless you're collecting information, you can't often know what outcomes you're achieving. So it depends, again, but I do personally encourage organizations to be collecting relevant information and have indicators of what you're producing so that you can tell. I don't care so much about your funders, but they like that information too, so that you can tell and improve your performance over time.
My question is that because of the decline in income, do you see on the horizon that religious organization will start being taxed?
No, I really don't see that. I think you know, that separation of church and state, that's a pretty strong cultural norm in our country. However, if there are associated organizations that have been set up and they are, you know, really businesses in disguise, I could see more questioning of those kinds of relationships, but I don't think the congregations are going to be taxed in my lifetime or yours.
This may not be directly for you, but will there be a DVD of this presentation?
Online at theclintonschoolspeakers.com, and then you can also get them, DVDs of them.
I noticed in your research, I was looking for cause-related marketing, and I wonder if you've compiled any data with regards to that and how effective that is. You know, of course, Susan G. Komen does that. I know Red Dress is on Coca-Cola products now. You know, Habitat for Humanity, you can get a credit card. I just wonder what you have to say about that form of fundraising.
Be careful. No, we don't have any data on that. Actually, I was interviewed on that topic not too many weeks ago. BP, the oil spill, you know, what's going to happen to the nonprofits that are associated with BP? It's a good question. And it's happened in the past where nonprofits have, you know, become aligned with an organization that really wasn't, you know, at the end of the day, its mission and the nonprofit mission were on collision course, and often the nonprofit then, you know, takes a little turn. And it's also gone the other way, where a nonprofit gets in trouble and the corporation that's in the cause-related relationship wants to back down too. So it could go both ways. No, I don't have data on that. There are some studies on it, though. I think you could probably find them maybe at Indiana University.
In your opening remarks, you said that nonprofit was a large sector and growing. Of the different demographics of the nonprofits, what sector do you think is going to be the biggest growth area in the decade to come?
Well, you know, interestingly enough, the biggest growth area, there are two of them, one is international, one's environment, but they're coming from a very small base. So you can see from international organizations, only 1.2%. So they're growing very quickly, but they're still a tiny part of the sector. Same with environment. They're growing quickly. And religious organizations, religiously affiliated organizations are also growing quickly.
One other question real quickly. Do you have statistics that show that it's a surprise to the general public how large a sector of the nonprofit is?
No, I don't. But that's would be an interesting polling thing to do. Yeah. I think when I talk to people, they're kind of open their eyes. And certainly if you go to the Hill and say 5% of GDP, they sit up and listen. So that data, again, is just very, very important in terms of getting the story across. But we have to be careful to differentiate among the types of organizations and to build common cause with organizations that are probably very different, but all are trying to serve the public and provide public benefits. If we can get to that level of our commonality, then we can help the sector along.
Perhaps to that regard, if you could expand, when I look at the chart of human services, arts, culture, and humanities, the resources are diminishing, the donor availability is diminishing. What are they doing, if any, to join forces, despite the fact that they have perhaps sacred cows of missions or protocols, but how are they communicating better together to pool resources, efficiencies, and maybe consolidate one mission into another to survive?
Well, as you may know, quite a few arts organizations and music organizations have gone belly up in this recession. Symphonies, orchestras, opera companies, ballet companies, we've lost quite a few. But there are some initiatives. The Pew Foundation in Philadelphia started up a database and started it for the state of Pennsylvania, where all the arts organizations put in their information, their data, and all the funders then can go to one place. You don't have to do a separate grant application and filling out all the forms. One place, one-stop shop for all that information. So that's a savings. That idea is being picked up in California and several other states. So that's not consolidation of the organizations, but certainly coming together to make some sense of their sector and also to drive the efficiency. And then, by the way, collect data on their effectiveness too. So I think that's one answer.
Because you have a love of advocacy and civil engagement, this is more of a what's your thought versus data. I'm with the arts, and I was recently in a conversation with a very close friend who's a lobbyist, and we were talking about how to advocate for the arts. And she was explaining to me that the clients that they have, it could be engineers, it could be hospitals, basically how they get the ear of their lawmakers, representatives, is by making a certainly a memorable, sizable, recognizable donation to their campaigns. So, I'm wondering if that's the way the game is played, how do we go about, doing that on behalf of arts and culture and humanities, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting because the Citizens United versus FEC, the Supreme Court case, which now has ruled that corporations, and guess what, nonprofits are corporations, can have sort of unlimited campaign contributions. However, we have the tax law prohibitions against that kind of political activity. So I don't think it's in the cards for nonprofits per se to do that. I think it's the moral suasion that you've got to use. I don't see campaign contributions in our future. If you want to go the route of AstroTurf organizations, create a fake organization and funnel money through it, but I don't think that would be to the benefit of the sector. I think we've got to rely on the good that is done and the communities that we serve and stories. You've got to tell stories about the difference, and you've got to know what difference you make. And I think it's education. We've come from 20 years ago when what is a nonprofit to some understanding that government, that we do a lot of work in our communities, to now we have needs and we're speaking for people who have needs, and for quality of life issues, the environment and arts and culture, all of which are important to our communities and to our lives. I think we've got to hone our messages and don't be afraid of repeating it.
Earlier you mentioned that diversity is a dominant feature. In terms of young leadership and minority leadership? How do we create a cadre of professionals that can take data and research and make the high-level thinking and analysis that it takes to affect change in respective communities?
Well, leadership is an issue that a lot of folks are talking about in the nonprofit sector. Both the diversity of the leadership itself, does it reflect the population and the changing demographics of our country? And it doesn't completely. Bringing in new generations of young people and preparing them for service in the nonprofit sector. On the one hand, we have now courses in over 200 colleges and universities that are providing management, fundraising, business skills for nonprofit executives. So I would say that's something we didn't have 20 years ago or even really 15 years ago. So there is that sort of pipeline that's being created. So I think we're in a better place now than we were, but we have to pay attention to it. There's a whole generation of folks my age who are going to be retiring. And there's some concern and some studies that show that there are going to be a lot of jobs in this sector and that we're not really prepared to bring in new leadership. So in your organizations, are you mentoring somebody who can step up to the plate? Do you have internships, service learning, different opportunities? I have internships in my center, emerging leaders I call them, emerging scholars. But that's something that almost every organization could do to help build that leadership capacity and give a taste to the young people what it's like to be in the nonprofit sector. I know Hunter has done a lecture on the life of the day of a nonprofit executive. I think that's a powerful kind of an experience for somebody to hear and learn about, especially young people who are considering all of their options.
And then you can send them to the Clinton School of Public
Then
Service.
we can send them to the Clinton School.
And
Very
get their
good.
Masters of Public Service. You just have one.
My name is Oscar Castañeda. I work at Heifer International. I'm quite interested in this graphic, and that is a quick question. I have a larger question. In this graphic, you are presenting the number of nonprofits and then segmenting them in terms of the different groupings, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that is not an estimate in terms of revenue that they, and the way that the revenue...
No. This is the numbers of organizations. If I were to do it by revenue, and actually let's go. What I haven't done is done size and type. So different sizes. But in this graphic right here, what you would have at the bottom, $10 million or more, would be mostly hospitals and universities. And up at the other end, under 100,000, you'd have environmental groups, some recreation groups, some human services. So there would be an interesting breakdown. I just didn't bring it with me.
Then the other comment before my question is that you have presented a lot of information about the different elements that characterize this group. There is described, there is described by a double negation. We are part of the nonprofit and non-governmental organization, but there is very little about the identity in a positive way. What are we as a sector within society? So that's one element. But then the question is, how then can be whether you have carried out analysis in terms of the impact of the whole sector in terms of the definition of the mission and how that can get it measured at the moment that is achieved, so that then efficiency and effectiveness can be described.
Well, you're right. I was going to put the slide in about public benefit and values. Nonprofit organizations are the guardian of our values in the society, religious and cultural values. They have to be dedicated to public purposes, or they wouldn't be nonprofit organizations under our laws. So there definitely are mission-related values that they've been set up to further, and that's a condition of being a charity in this country. So you're right, and you have to have that mission in terms of what, you have to have your goals in terms of your mission, what it is you're trying to achieve. if you're trying to eradicate poverty or improve the status of women or provide, recreation for children or whatever it is, that mission has to be, and then your goals have to be measured in terms of your ultimate mission. So I agree with you, and I didn't present the positive and, talk more about what organizations do. Does that answer your question? Performance. What we're doing in terms of performance measurement is identifying from the organizations themselves what are the indicators of success that they would like to be held accountable for. So right now we're working on some mentoring organizations. And some mentoring organizations have told us that they want the young people that they're mentoring, they want them to graduate from high school, they want them to get a job, they want them to go to college. So organizations have different goals. Some want to raise their achievement in school. Some want them to be more socially adept. But those indicators then are the ones against which the organization will measure its progress. So they have to get school records, for example, if they're trying to improve the academic performance of the young people, then they have to get school records and show an increase over time. If they're trying to help, if their ultimate goal is to get these kids into jobs, then they have to follow them after their mentoring program to see whether or not they got jobs. Am I answering your question? So the organization itself has to determine what indicators it would like to measure. What we're doing on our portal when it becomes active is we'll have talked to thousands of organizations about, and hundreds will be in the mentoring area. What are the 10 common indicators that mentoring organizations almost always measure? And so a nonprofit could go to that site and say, and how do I measure it? And there'll be a survey or a tool or something to help. So we're just trying to get that information out to make it easier. But organization have to have a mission, goals, indicators that you would like to follow, and then measure them and get the information on them.